In 1980, a rock-cut tomb surfaced in a Jerusalem construction zone. Decades later, a TV documentary rebranded it the Lost Tomb of Jesus, arguing that a cluster of inscribed limestone bone boxes, ossuaries, pointed to Jesus of Nazareth, his relatives, and even a supposed spouse. If true, Christianity's central claim would collapse. If false, we've learned how persuasive stories can outrun stubborn evidence. This film doesn't ask you to pick a side yet. It asks you to sit with the evidence, to let archaeology speak its cautious language, and to notice where rhetoric runs faster than rock. We begin at the door of the Talpiot tomb. This episode discusses contested religious claims, death burial practices, and challenges to core Christian beliefs. We handle these topics respectfully, but some viewers may find them sensitive. Our aim is to examine methods and evidence, not to attack faith or promote conspiracies. When sources are uncertain, they will be flagged as unverified. Proceed with care, and remember that historical method deals in probabilities, not certainties. The cliff we're walking has a railing, transparency about what we know, what we don't, and how we know it. Ready to test claims without torching nuance? Then step inside.
Here's the landscape we're entering. Ossuary burials in Judea, laying a body on a bench, later gathering the bones into a limestone box, were common in the late Second Temple period. Names like Yeshua or Jesus, Yosef or Joseph, and Maria or Mariamne appear frequently in inscriptions from this era. In 2007, a documentary popularized the idea that a particular tomb in the Talpiot neighborhood held ossuaries reading Jesus, son of Joseph, Mary, Jose or Yose, and more, implying a unique family cluster. Counterclaims quickly followed. Excavators who mapped the tomb in 1980 disputed sensational readings. Epigraphers questioned letter forms and readings. Statisticians warned that common name soup can look significant when you stir it the right way. Meanwhile, a separate market-surfaced object, the James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus ossuary, was floated as a missing piece allegedly tied to the same tomb. Our task is not to relitigate personalities, but to weigh claims against method, stratigraphy, epigraphy, provenance, and probability. The ground rule is simple. Extraordinary claims aren't the enemy. Undocumented shortcuts are. And this story has a lot of shortcuts to check. The spark isn't a single inscription. It's the stacking of several. Jesus, son of Joseph. A second ossuary labeled Judah, son of Jesus. One or more Maria Mariamne variants. A Jose Yose nickname paralleling a New Testament brother's diminutive, and a disputed reading Mariamne that some popularizers equated with Mary Magdalene. On top of that, there was a DNA soundbite, two individuals not sharing a maternal line. These were interpreted as husband and wife, and with that, you've got a viral script, not a vetted dossier. On top of that, there was a symbol on stone, filmed without its matching lid, and you can persuade an audience to see an early Christian sign where stonemasons might only have marked orientation. Finally, float the missing 10th ossuary and speculate that it's the famous James box from the antiquities market, and the puzzle suddenly looks solved if you don't examine the edges.
Our inciting incident is the moment we refuse to take the montage at face value. From here, we'll audit each pillar of the claim with a three-part lens: what was filmed or reported, what the relevant specialists actually argue, and what probabilities remain once hype is subtracted. If the cluster survives sober scrutiny, it deserves credit. If it dissolves into common names, misread letters, and leaps of logic, the audience deserves to see that dissolution in daylight. Either way, the next room down the tomb shaft is where rhetoric meets limestone. Our first audit starts with the simplest pillar, names. The documentary's power hinges on a feeling that this cluster, Jesus son of Joseph, Mary, Jose or Yosei, Judah son of Jesus, perhaps a Mariamne, is too coincidental to be random. It sounds compelling until you restore the base rates that any epigrapher or historian would insist on bringing to the site. Ossuary burial in Judea during the late Second Temple period generated thousands of limestone boxes, and a very small pool of personal names dominated inscriptions of the period. When a culture prefers a handful of names, clusters of those names are not remarkable, they are inevitable. If you toss 6 common dice long enough, you will eventually roll what looks like a pattern. The pattern is not the miracle, the base rates are. Begin with Yeshua, the Hebrew or Aramaic form of Jesus. It was not rare. Yosef or Joseph was even more popular, and Mariam or Maria was among the era's most frequent female names. Combine a common male name with an even more common patronymic, and you get an inscription, Jesus, son of Joseph, that can honestly describe many interrelated individuals in the same generation. Add that ossuaries often included abbreviated or nickname forms, Yosei or Joe, Mara, Mattia or Mathai, and you quickly see how easily a family-sized set of boxes in almost any urban neighborhood might replicate the New Testament's onomastic landscape without referring to the specific family from Nazareth. The statistical seduction here is to mistake familiarity for specificity, and familiarity is the enemy of unique identification.
But statistics alone are not the whole story. Context matters. Ossuaries in a rock-cut tomb represent multi-generational internments. Bodies were laid out on benches, skeletal remains gathered about a year later, and placed into boxes set in niches or kohim. Names helped families locate a box in future visits, but labeling practices varied widely, and many ossuaries were left uninscribed. A tomb with 10 boxes and 6 inscriptions cannot by itself tell you which extended family used it, unless the inscriptions contain unique, context-rich identifiers, uncommon names, rare combinations, or explicit kinship triads that align with independent textual evidence. The Talpiot cluster, by contrast, sits almost entirely inside the common pool, and this is why numerous specialists were skeptical long before television cameras panned across the shelves. Even when a name looks promising, reading it is a discipline, not a vibe. Epigraphy, deciphering letter forms, damaged strokes, ligatures, and scribal quirks, belongs in a lab-bright world of raking light, squeeze impressions, and trained comparanda. The leap from a worn inscription to a famous figure requires meticulous letter-by-letter argument, not a freeze frame. The proposed identification of Mariamne with Mary Magdalene illustrates the danger. If the reading itself is uncertain, or if the supposed nickname is anachronistic for the figure in question, then the name's unusualness evaporates on contact with method. A sensational reading that collapses under paleographic scrutiny is not a weak footnote, it is a missing leg. The same caution applies to nicknames that happen to appear in literary sources. Yosei or Jose, a diminutive of Joseph, does occur in the New Testament for a brother of Jesus, and the documentary treats its presence in the tomb as a near-smoking gun. But diminutives by definition proliferate among common names.
Without an additional anchor, an uncommon cogname, an identifying title, a linkage inscription naming multiple known relatives, the path from a Jos in Jerusalem to that Jos from the Gospels is a methodological bridge too far. Archaeology loves convergence when independent lines point to the same place, but convergence demands independence. Borrowing the literary glow of a famous family to illuminate a routine ossuary sets the stage, not the standard.
There is also a subtle framing effect at work. The audience is shown a tight collage of inscriptions that happen to rhyme with the gospel cast list, rather than the wide-angle view of how many other tombs in the city display similar rhymes. In statistics, this is a sampling problem. In storytelling, it's a montage problem. If you highlight one cluster without showing the distribution it came from, human pattern recognition will do the rest. A sober approach would estimate how many tombs with comparable mixes of Jesus, Joseph, and Mary one should expect in a metropolis of that era, then ask what additional non-onomastic evidence exists to narrow the field to one family. The answer, in this case, is thin. Finally, provenance and excavation records matter. When the original excavators state that the tomb was typical, the names common, and the inscriptions unremarkable in isolation, their testimony does not settle the question, but it must be taken seriously, especially against reconstructions made years later for broadcast. Archaeology is not allergic to bold identifications. It simply requires that boldness be earned with context, controls, and cross-checks. Until a name steps out of the common pool with a truly distinctive marker, Jesus, son of Joseph, reads as a statistical echo, not a signature. The takeaway from Pillar 1 is not that names never tell us anything. It's that names tell us less than we want when the culture reuses the same few over and over. If the Talpiot hypothesis stands, it must stand on more than the comfort of familiar names. Which means our next step is to leave the lexicon and step into the stone itself, into letter forms, ligatures, and the uneasy marriage of cameras and chisels. In other words, if the cluster's strength is real, epigraphy should be its backbone, not its borrowed spotlight. If names are the wide-angle lens, epigraphy is the macro. What matters now is not how familiar a name feels, but how securely it is read. Inscriptions on ossuaries are frequently light, hurried, and uneven. They sit on coarse limestone with tool chatter, weathering, and burial grime. Good readings are built from method, raking light, macro photography, squeezes or 3D scans, letter-by-letter comparison with dated parallels, and an explicit discussion of damaged strokes and ambiguous ligatures. Popular treatments tend to invert that order. They start with the desired person, then squint until the letters agree. Our task is to reverse the polarity, begin with the stone, and permit the text to disappoint us if it must. Start with the most leveraged claim. That one inscription reads Mariamne, which some broadcasters equated with Mary Magdalene. Even before you ask whether a first-century Judean would be called Mariamne, you have to decide whether those letters are actually there. The script on ossuaries of this period is typically informal. Alpha forms tilt, mems collapse, news trail off, and word breaks go missing. A responsible reading enumerates each letter with alternatives. Is that an iota or a damaged yod? Is the medial group a compressed IAM or an IAN? Does the terminal stroke belong to the same hand? Without that audit trail, Mariamne is not a decipherment. It is a hope spelled in chalk. But suppose, for the sake of argument, the string does read some variant of Mariamne, Mariamne. The bridge from that orthography to Mary of Magdala is still a long one. Magdalene is a geographical epithet from Magdala, not a unique personal name, and nothing in the contested reading provides the toponym. Moreover,
Early Christian texts do not present Mariamne as a standard Magdalene form. Later literature and modern reconstructions sometimes do, but projecting later usage backward is precisely what epigraphy is designed to prevent. In other words, even a generous reading yields a common Mary, not a celebrity. When a single stone must carry an entire narrative arc, the arc is likely too heavy for the stone. Warm documentary also asks about hand, habit, and context. Are multiple inscriptions in the tomb by the same scribe? If not, a tidy family cluster loses cohesion at the level of the chisel. Do letter heights and ductus, the speed and pressure of strokes, match across the boxes claimed to be related? If they do not, you likely have different time slices of inscription, perhaps added years apart by different relatives or workers. That is normal behavior for family use. It is not evidence for or against a famous identity. The point is that variability in hand weakens any attempt to fuse several boxes into a single, tightly scripted Talpiot. The more scribes, the less the cluster can be read as a single authored statement. Then there is the quiet discipline of negatives, what an inscription does not say. Ossuary texts sometimes include kinship formulas: X, son of Y, Y, wife of Z, the bones of, or even a second-line identifier such as a nickname or origin. The more explicit the kinship triad, the more securely you can cross-check it with independent sources. In the Talpiot set, the crucial leaps occur precisely where the stone refuses specificity, where a Mary lacks a toponym, a Jose lacks an explicit sibling link, or a Jesus lacks any title that ties him to Nazareth rather than to hundreds of other households. Epigraphy is a conservative craft. Absence of specificity is not a puzzle to be solved by ingenuity, but a boundary to be respected. Reading also includes unreading, acknowledging when supposed letters are tool chatter, accidental scratches, or later abrasions. Human pattern recognition is so aggressive that archaeologists routinely test ambiguous marks under alternating light angles to see which strokes persist and which vanish. What looks like a meaningful diagonal under soft frontal lighting can disappear when lit from the side, revealing itself as a shallow nick. The ethical move, when a reading depends on such vanishing strokes, is to grade the confidence down and refrain from grand identifications. Any production that edits out the angles under which the key stroke fails is teaching the audience to prefer narrative over method.
Finally, epigraphy must converse with provenance. Inscriptions pulled from secure excavation contexts can be evaluated alongside locus notes, photographs, and daybooks. Inscriptions known only from the market, handled by dealers, cleaned, re-inked, or even recut, carry additional risk, unverified. This is why attempts to sew a market-surfaced inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, into the Talpiot tapestry raise immediate flags. Even before one debates authenticity or legal history, the methodological mismatch is stark. You cannot ask a controlled context to carry the weight of an uncontrolled one. The temptation to bridge them is understandable. The bridge, epigraphically speaking, is made of air. What survives this audit is not a thrilling cipher, but a sober portrait of ordinary practice. Hurried letters on soft stone, common names recorded for family use, and enough noise in the marks to demand humility. If the hypothesis on offer is true, it will one day be true epigraphically, with letters that stand up under hostile light and parallels that fix the forms securely in time. Until then, the only honest drama here is the craft of reading itself, and that craft refuses to turn ambiguity into fame on command. Next, We leave the letters behind for the lab bench, where the documentary made its boldest forensic leap, DNA, and for a symbol that looks less like a creed and more like a Mason's reminder. Forensics sells because it feels objective. In the Talpiot narrative, a lab extracts material from two ossuaries traditionally glassed as Jesus son of Joseph and Mariamne or Mariamne, and mitochondrial DNA tests indicate the two sampled individuals do not share a maternal line. From that single negative, not the same mother, the claim leaps to a positive, they were husband and wife, unverified. That inference is not science, it is a screenplay. mtDNA tracks maternal ancestry only. It cannot rule in or out paternal links, affinal relations, or sheer coincidence within a multi-generational family tomb, unverified. A father-daughter pair with different mothers, a father-in-law and daughter-in-law, a cousin by the father's side, or even two unrelated burials in the same family chamber would all produce the same mtDNA result. The correct forensic translation of not maternally related is relationship unknown. An unknown does not carry a romance on its back.
Warm documentary. There is a deeper problem with what the test omits. Any DNA recovered from ancient ossuary residue is already a survivor of time, humidity, handling, and potential contamination across decades, unverified. Proper aDNA work reports chain of custody, controls for modern contamination, replication in independent labs, and the statistical confidence of haplotype calls. A TV-ready montage rarely has the patience for that paperwork, unverified. Even if we grant the negative result at face value, scientific restraint forbids turning a maternal non-match into a marital yes. Archaeology loves stories, but the lab loves null hypotheses. And here, the null wins. The second bold stitch in the tapestry is the missing 10th ossuary, said to have vanished between excavation and storage, hypothesized to be the market-surfaced James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, box. This is a triumph of narrative over provenance. The excavation records describe the 10th box as plain, broken, undecorated, and uninscribed. The famous James ossuary is whole, decorated, and bears an inscription whose authenticity and history have been the subject of entirely separate debates, unverified. Bridging those two artifacts requires more than mood. It requires documented movement, matching materials, and a paper trail that survives legal and scientific scrutiny. Unverified. Without that, the missing equals James move is a classic case of confirmation bias. When a hole appears in your puzzle, you go shopping for the perfect piece. Then there is the symbol. A triangular mark with a dot, filmed attractively on a box lid, set aside for the camera, is presented as an early Christian sign. When the lid is replaced in its original orientation, corresponding marks on lid and box align like an installation guide, a mason's mark to ensure a hand-cut lid sits correctly without dropping inside and shattering bones, unverified. Stonemasons leave practical messages to their future selves. They rarely leave creeds. The most telling evidence is not the symbol's shape, but the edit that hid its partner. When an argument requires the absence of context to remain persuasive, context is exactly what the audience deserves.
Warm. Documentary. Pulling back, the pattern across these claims is consistent. Where the data are weakest, the rhetoric is strongest. A maternal non-match becomes an implicit marriage. A documented plain, broken box becomes the inscribed relic that headlines a controversy. An alignment mark becomes a confession of faith. The cumulative effect is not convergence, it is compounding error. And yet the presence of error in a popular film does not, by itself, settle the real historical questions. Archaeology is not a court that convicts documentaries.
It is a method that tests claims against controlled contexts, reproducible readings, and the unforgiving math of base rates. That math extends beyond names to expectations about a city's mortuary landscape. In a metropolis with thousands of interments and a short list of preferred names, several tombs will, by chance, echo the onomastic cast of a well-known family, unverified. To elevate any one of them to the family tomb, you need additional anchors. Securely read inscriptions that provide specific, uncommon identifiers, stratigraphic notes that tie boxes together in time, and independent textual or architectural markers that converge on the same individuals. The Talpiot cluster provides none of these at a level that survives strict scrutiny, unverified. Its strongest appeal lies in montage, not in method. And yet, because the stakes are existential for Christian claims, resurrection, empty tomb, early testimony, skeptics, believers, and the merely curious deserve more than a debunking. They deserve a positive account of what the best evidence actually supports. That is where the field tends to find firmer ground, not in Talpiot's speculative web, but in the broader, more boring agreement about Jesus' death under Roman authority, burial, early proclamation of an empty tomb, and experiences interpreted as post-mortem appearances, followed by a live question. Which explanation best fits those points? Unverified. We will get there, but first we need a clean statement of what Talpiot does and does not establish. In other words, it's time to stop chasing edits and start weighing evidence, stone, text, and tradition, side by side.
Let's put each pillar on the scale and say plainly what survives scrutiny and what does not. First, the cluster of names. That several ossuaries in a first-century Jerusalem tomb bear inscriptions like Yeshua, Jesus, Yosef, Joseph, Maria, Mariamne, and the diminutive like Yose or Josie is consistent with citywide name frequencies. This is not a bespoke signature. It is a chorus of common names. Verdict, explained by base rates. The cluster may be interesting, but it is not intrinsically identifying. Second, Jesus, son of Joseph. As an inscription, it is straightforward. As an identification with Jesus of Nazareth, it is not. Without an uncommon epithet, a toponym such as the Nazarene, or a triangulating kinship formula that aligns with independent sources, the phrase can describe many unrelated men in the same generation. Verdict, not specifically tied to Jesus of Nazareth. Third, Mariamne as Mary Magdalene. Even granting a favorable reading of the contested letters, the leap from a common Mary form to the famed Magdalene lacks a toponymic link and an early textual basis. Later literature cannot be back-projected to close the gap. Verdict, contested reading, identification fails on method. Fourth, Judah, son of Jesus. If secure, it tells us that some Jesus fathered a Judah. It does not tell us which Jesus. In a culture of repeated names and multi-generational burials, this line does not reach Nazareth on its own. Verdict, too generic to decide the question. Fifth, the DNA move. A maternal non-match between two sampled individuals says only that they do not share a mother. It does not establish marriage or any specific a final link. Without full ancient DNA protocols, independent replication, and a design that asks a testable question,
The result is a narrow negative, repurposed as a sweeping positive. Verdict: unsupported inference.
Sixth, the missing 10th ossuary equated with the market-surfaced James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Excavation notes describing a plain, broken, uninscribed box cannot be reconciled with a whole, decorated, inscribed artifact without a chain of custody and material matches that withstand legal and scientific review. Verdict: contradicted by recorded context. Seventh, the early Christian symbol. When the lid is restored and the paired marks align as orientation guides, the simplest reading, Mason's marks, outperforms the theological one. Verdict: better explained by craft practice. What, then, does Talpiot positively teach? That multiple interments used a rock-cut family tomb in late Second Temple Jerusalem. That ossuary practice was alive and well. That families labeled some boxes and left others blank. And that the city's onomastic landscape was narrow enough to create deceptive clusters by chance. Those are valuable, if unglamorous, lessons. They remind us that probability is a better guide than wishful reading, and that provenance records from the original excavators deserve priority over reconstructions designed for broadcast. None of this adjudicates the larger historical claims: Jesus' death under Roman authority, the origin of resurrection belief, or the status of the tomb venerated at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It does, however, empty Talpiot of the weight it was never fit to carry. A cautious synthesis, based on the evidence surveyed here, reads like this. Talpiot is a typical first-century family tomb, whose inscriptions fall within common naming patterns. No inscription in the set, as currently read, uniquely identifies the tomb with Jesus of Nazareth or his immediate family. The forensic and symbolic arguments proposed to tighten that identification are methodologically flawed. That conclusion is not a triumph of dogma over data. It is the opposite, a refusal to make data say more than they can.
Warm documentary. If the Talpiot hypothesis had been right, it would still need to be right by archaeological standards: provenance, epigraphy, statistics, and replicable lab work. It is not. The disappointment is clarifying. It tells us where to look next, not to fill gaps with romance, but to ask where the strongest convergence now lies between texts, stones, and tradition. That path leads out of Talpiot toward the sites, strata, and testimonies that most historians, across confessional lines, regard as the best candidates for situating Jesus' burial and the rise of resurrection belief. Which leaves us with a bigger, more interesting question. Given the modest but solid things we can say, what broader picture of sites and sources actually fits them best? Stepping back from one tomb sharpens our view of the landscape. Across confessional lines, many historians converge on a modest core. Jesus of Nazareth was executed under Roman authority. He was buried. Within a very short time, his followers proclaimed an empty tomb and reported experiences they interpreted as appearances. And the movement reorganized itself around that conviction. Those points do not decide theology, but they do set constraints. Any archaeological hypothesis that addresses burial and memory has to fit this frame without special pleading. Talpiot does not. It neither explains the rise of resurrection belief, nor coheres with the strongest candidates for Jesus' burial site in Jerusalem's memory map. That memory map matters. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not proof by tradition, but it anchors a long, complicated chain of remembrance to a quarry-turned-garden precinct that plausibly housed first-century tombs. Excavations beneath chapels, the exposure of bedrock features, and architectural phases from the 4th century backward make it, in many scholars' view, the best supported candidate for the site venerated from late antiquity onward. The garden tomb, beautiful, unbeloved, likely reflects a different era of rock cutting. Its appeal is pastoral more than probabilistic. None of these conclusions are final. Jerusalem's subsoil keeps its secrets, but they illustrate how convergence across texts, topography, and material culture carries more weight than a collage of common names.
There is also a methodological moral that outlives any single case. Archaeology is not in the business of rescuing or refuting faith. It adjudicates claims with tools that reward patience and punish shortcuts. Provenance is a tool. Epigraphy is a tool. Statistical literacy is a tool. When those tools are used openly, showing the angles under which letters disappear, the alternative readings that were declined, the base rates that trim romantic coincidences, public trust grows, even when conclusions disappoint someone's hopes. Conversely, when edits hide context, marked pieces are sewn to excavated contexts, or lab results are narrated beyond their tested scope, trust bleeds away and takes curiosity with it. The broader story of Bible and archaeology is healthiest where questions are narrow and evidence cumulative. Stones do not authenticate creeds, but they can clarify the worlds that creeds claim. Burial customs, administrative titles, village economies, the layout of a city, the pressure points of empire. And the tools are improving. Ancient DNA protocols are stricter, contamination controls better. Micro-CT and multispectral imaging can read palimpsest strokes invisible to the eye. Structured light and photogrammetry let anyone rotate an inscription at home. AI, carefully leashed, can segment letter forms without hallucinating history. These advances won't settle resurrection. They can, however, make us better readers of broken lines and better judges of claims dressed for television. Most viewers do not need certainty. They need candor. If a claim is possible but unproven, say so. If a reading is fragile, grade it. If a tradition is strong but not ironclad, explain why scholars provisionally lean on it. In a media ecosystem tuned for outrage, slow clarity is a kind of rebellion and a service. Which brings us to the ethic of telling these stories at all. How to invite wonder without weaponizing it. How to respect belief without insulating it from questions. And how to disagree without scorning the people who care. That ethic is the spine of this series, and the next section names it. The moral is not that faith must hide from evidence, or that evidence can settle every article of faith. It is that honesty about limits is the shortest route to wisdom. When an inscription is ambiguous, we grade it. When a statistic misleads, we reframe it. When a tradition is strong but not airtight, we show the seams. This posture, intellectual hospitality with methodological teeth, protects more than reputations. It protects our capacity to learn. If you hold to the resurrection, you need not fear what stones can or cannot say. If you doubt it, you deserve better than stories that dress conjecture as data. Either way, the discipline is the same. Slow down, disclose uncertainty, and let reality push back. Here is how we'll live that ethic together. In the description, you'll find primary and secondary sources for every major claim in this episode. Excavation reports, epigraphic discussions, statistical surveys of names, and the best overviews of Jerusalem's burial topography. Read them. Argue with us. Send counterarguments with citations, not just adjectives. If you want more of this kind of work, field sites, artifact deep dives, and fact versus claim audits, subscribe, hit the bell, and share this episode with one friend who loves the subject but hates the hype. It helps more than you think. Finally, tell us where to take the camera next. Do you want an on-location walkthrough at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to see why many scholars consider it the strongest candidate for Jesus' tomb? Or a close reading session with a high-resolution model of the Tel Dan stele to show how epigraphy actually works, stroke by stroke? Vote in the comments, and we'll stack the next shoot accordingly. We won't promise certainty. We will promise receipts. Because the only thing better than a good story is a true one, or at least one that admits where truth is still out of reach, waiting in the next chamber.
We began with a door cut into limestone and a question larger than any single tomb. We leave with fewer illusions, more context, and a clearer map of where evidence carries weight and where it does not. The Talpiot cluster is a lesson in why patient method beats rapid montage, why base rates interrupt tidy narratives, and why marks on stone need their lids back on before we infer creeds. None of this answers every mystery. It does something humbler and therefore braver. It sets the terms on which the next discovery will be tested. In the episodes ahead, we'll put our boots where the claims live, among the bedrock benches beneath the city of prayers, under vaults where stone remembers chisel pressure, and in reading rooms where letters from 2 millennia ago still negotiate meaning with the present. Bring curiosity, bring skepticism, bring the willingness to change your mind when reality votes. The past is not silent. It just speaks softly, and we're learning to listen. See you at the next threshold, where the light dims, the air cools, and the story narrows to the width of a chisel stroke.